William Mackus, who's here to talk to us about the latest breakthroughs that he has in oncology research. What does he have to tell us? Stay tuned to find out. Welcome to the Kiwi Rock. How are you today?
Good, thank you very much.
So I see that you've published a paper on repurposed drugs that are being used to potentially treat cancer. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Certainly. There's been an explosion of cancers in the last few years, and the mainstream medical establishment is well, at first they were ignoring it. Now they're having to admit that young people are getting cancer at extremely alarming rates. And probably a lot of it is due to the COVID-19 vaccines that have damaged the immune systems of millions of people in all the highly vaccinated countries. And so you have these extremely aggressive cancers, these stage 4 cancers that are being diagnosed in young people. You have 20-year-old women coming down with stage 4 breast cancer. We've never seen that before. You've got 20, 30-year-olds coming down with stage 4 colon cancers. We've never seen that before. And so we have this phenomenon of just an explosion of cancers. And that has led some of us to really explore, some alternative approaches to treating these cancers. Some of these cancers are behaving extremely aggressively. Some of these cancers are resisting chemotherapy. They're not responding to chemotherapy. They're not responding to radiation therapy. They're not responding to brand new immunotherapies. And so you want patients to have options. And the oncologists, unfortunately, many of whom took the COVID-19 vaccines themselves and are themselves coming down with aggressive cancers, the oncologists are not giving their patients a lot of options. In fact, a lot of them are not allowed to give their patients options beyond, the chemotherapy that they're ordered to sell by Big Pharma. And we know that what's in the pipelines from the mainstream establishment are, mRNA cancer vaccines that are going to cost $500,000 and that we already know that they don't work. And so, some of us have been really researching repurposed drugs. I know the FLCCC and doctors like Dr. Paul Merrick, Dr. Pierre Corey have been looking at repurposing certain drugs and supplements. I've done heavy research into repurposed drugs. And about 2 years ago, I discovered that certain antiparasitics have very strong anti-cancer properties. That there's a big body of preclinical research with Ivermectin. And we often wondered why Ivermectin was so heavily suppressed when it came to COVID-19, especially with FDA telling people, you're not a horse, you're not a cow, don't take Ivermectin. When in reality, thousands of people treated their COVID successfully with Ivermectin. But it turns out there's this whole body of research on ivermectin and cancer that no one ever told us about. The doctors never told us about. And why is that? Because ivermectin is cheap and it went off patent. It went off patent in the 1990s. Merck abandoned ivermectin. And in fact, more recently, Merck has signed a deal with Moderna to help them make their new cancer mRNA vaccine. And so it's an abandoned drug. It's an abandoned antiparasitic drug that has tremendous anti-cancer properties. And there are other antiparasitic drugs like Fenbendazole, Menbendazole that also have a tremendous amount of preclinical research behind them. And so these are drugs that I've been trying to bring into the mainstream. I was recommending it to patients who were in desperate situations, had stage 4 cancers. And then months later, they start coming back to me and they're telling me their tumors are shrinking and that their oncologists are shocked and baffled and their oncologists have no idea what's going on and why they're improving on these antiparasitic drugs. So, a number of us got together, we extensively reviewed the research, and we've put out really the first protocol in the world that uses these repurposed antiparasitic drugs to try to help doctors around the world give some options to their cancer patients.
How many stages do you need to go through in order to get this to be a more prominent scientific study? Do you need to do some more randomized testing, larger studies? What would you need? Oh, I think it's got a lot of promise.
We want to have obviously large studies done. We want to have, the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. Right now, it's in the preclinical research stage. So that means that researchers have looked at certain cancer cell cultures, or they've looked at studies on mice or rats, or there's some, individual case reports that have been published. In the case of ivermectin, there's a number of children that have achieved remission that had leukemia that took ivermectin and achieved remission with some extremely aggressive leukemias. In terms of fenbendazole, for example, there were 3 individuals who were published by a Stanford University group as having cured their cancer with fenbendazole. And in the case of menbendazole, for example, there are a dozen clinical trials right now that are ongoing, cancer trials that are looking at menbendazole. The problem is that when you have a pharmaceutical industry and a sort of a medical establishment that are co-opted, the medical establishment being co-opted by the pharmaceutical industry, you will not get these trials that you need. To do the trials, obviously, it takes resources, it takes funding, it takes grants. Those are often approved by institutions that are completely captured by the pharmaceutical industry. And so the things that get studied are the things that the pharmaceutical industry wants to make money on, and not what's promising. Usually the promising stuff ends up getting the preclinical research and then it gets stuck. It simply doesn't move forward because there's no money to be made. Oncology, I think people have to remember that oncology is one of the biggest money makers in medicine. And, money controls everything. And so when it comes to cancer, you will get trials for drugs that will make minimum hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient. And really, a patient is looked at as a consumer, not as a patient. So there's no interest in curing a cancer patient. There's interest in monetizing a cancer patient as a consumer. You want to be able to make at least $500,000 on a cancer patient. That's the way the pharmaceutical industry looks at it. And so those are the drugs that are going to be investigated and have large trials and so on. That's why there's such a push right now towards mRNA cancer vaccines. We have phase 3 trials of mRNA cancer vaccines going right now in Australia, in the UK, and they've already told us what the price tag is going to be. It's going to be, 400,000 pounds. It's going to be 500,000 US dollars. That's going to be the price tag for these new cancer vaccines. And I've looked at some of the data of these mRNA cancer vaccines from Moderna, and these vaccines don't seem to work at all. They're usually combining them with other non-mRNA technologies that just to try to make the thing look like it works. But, it all comes down to money. So, when you look at ivermectin, it's off patent. It's dirt cheap. Ivermectin will cost you $1 a pill, the generic version. And that's how, my cancer patients are buying ivermectin at $1 a pill. Fenbendazole, again, it's going to cost you pennies to maybe $1 a pill. The mebendazole generic version, about $1 or $2 a pill. No one is going to make money, and so no one's going to make these trials. So what we'll end up with is we'll end up in a situation where people are going to take these on their own, or they will rely on certain health professionals like myself to either coach them or guide them in terms of dosing and side effects and so on. But really, cancer patients can't expect help from their oncologists when it comes to repurposed drugs.
Okay, so you say that the pharmaceutical industry makes a lot of money off these drugs. Do you think that maybe the vaccines, mRNA vaccines for COVID, could have had a link to the cancers that are emerging now?
Well, I think there's a growing body of evidence that the mRNA vaccines have had a number of very damaging effects for the recipients, especially to the immune system. And so one thing I noticed early on in 2021, and certainly throughout 2022, when the vaccines rolled out, and I saw this in the government data in Canada, in the UK, Scotland, Australia, we saw that there was a shift over time where the hospitals ended up being filled with the vaccinated. And initially we were led to believe that there was a pandemic of the unvaccinated, which was completely fraudulent. There was no such thing. What they were doing was they were saying, anyone who had a shot within the first 2 weeks was counted still as unvaccinated, even though that's when a lot of the problems started happening. And so, we would see that the hospitals would fill up with the vaccinated and that they were getting sicker at a disproportionate amount. And this was eventually proven by the Cleveland Clinic study of 50,000 healthcare workers, which had showed that the more vaccines you took, the COVID-19 vaccines, the more likely you were to get infected with COVID-19. And so there was clearly evidence that there was immune system damage from the vaccines, and the vaccinated they were always getting sick. And they were always complaining that they're catching COVID over and over again. Even though they were wearing masks, even though they were taking their booster shots, they were constantly sick. And we see this a lot. And so the damage to the immune system was very obvious. And this is, beyond the heart issues with the myocarditis or neurological issues with things like Guillain-Barré and MS and transverse myelitis. There was something happening to the immune system. And of course, when you damage the immune system, you're potentially damaging cancer surveillance and you're increasing the risk of cancer when you've got a damaged immune system. And I think this has been being published. There's more and more evidence of this. This phenomenon of turbo cancer, these extremely aggressive cancers that develop in people who've had at least one COVID-19 vaccine. We've got dozens of case reports now, cancers developing after vaccination, mostly lymphomas, but other cancers as well. And we've got dozens more papers looking at the potential mechanisms of how these vaccines may be causing these aggressive cancers.
So, if you did want to do a larger trial, what resources would you need to actually support that?
Well, you would need funding. I mean, you would
Yeah.
need a grant. You would need a grant from the NIH, for example, or a grant from NSERC or something like that. And because you need nurses, you need technologists, you need all kinds of research staff to be able to do a proper clinical trial. It's something that's really quite involved. It's not something that one person can do, in their garage, right? To do a proper clinical trial. So it does take resources, and unfortunately, the funding, it's simply there's no interest. There's no interest in mainstream oncology to even attempt to get such funding. And I'll tell you, for example, we've had a doctor in Canada, for example, who was fined $40,000 and stripped of his license for giving a couple of prescriptions for ivermectin for COVID-19 back in 2021. And so doctors are actually being penalized for using repurposed drugs like ivermectin. And so he was repurposing it from an antiparasitic role to an antiviral role, which there was, tremendous evidence for doing that. And yet, the medical board penalized him $40,000 and he lost his license for several months. More recently in the United States, we've had the persecutions of Dr. Pierre Corey, Dr. Paul Merrick, who were stripped of their internal medicine certifications, again, for supporting ivermectin, supporting hydroxychloroquine. So, really the medical establishment goes after doctors for trying to use repurposed drugs, especially ivermectin was specifically targeted because ivermectin was really the gateway to a multi-hundred billion dollar industry. So you had to suppress ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine in order to get the emergency authorization and then to get hundreds of billions of dollars in profit, in the mRNA vaccines, which we found out were basically failed technologies that had failed in oncology in the past. They were kind of repackaged as vaccines. Now we find out that the mRNA vaccines are actually contaminated with DNA plasmids, DNA fragments. That increases risk of cancer as well. But it was basically an attempt to push these new flawed pharmaceutical products that were worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And ivermectin was one of the sacrificial lambs, hydroxychloroquine being, the other one. And so right now, doctors are afraid to even consider, using ivermectin or researching it. And so, I've got hundreds of patients right now, for example, who are taking ivermectin for cancer, who are taking fenbendazole or mebendazole. I'm doing it outside of the mainstream oncology establishment. We're doing it as a cancer coaching situation rather than a doctor-patient relationship situation, because again, the authorities could, try to come after me and punish me for trying to help cancer patients. And that's what it really is. It's punishment of doctors for trying to help their patients.
What's your opinion on medical suicide, euthanasia that's going on in Canada at the moment? I'm aware that some vaccine injured people are being offered medical assisted suicide.
That's an interesting situation. We've been on a slippery slope for a while with medically assisted suicide in Canada, and I know right now that this is being pushed in the UK as well. It started in Canada very sort of inconspicuously. It was presented and packaged as something that would be only reserved for terminally ill patients who are in, really desperate situations, in a lot of pain and so on. And that's how it started. And then they the government basically kept pushing the envelope and kept expanding the eligibility for medically assisted suicide to the point where now, a person who's just living in poverty can be approved for medically assisted suicide, or a person who, has been injured by the COVID-19 vaccines can get approval for medically assisted suicide. And we had a case like that recently. I wrote about it. There was a man in Ontario who had suffered injury from the COVID-19 vaccines. He had three of the COVID-19 vaccines, so the first two vaccines and a booster shot. He was injured, suffering neurological conditions. And what we see is that once you've been injured by the COVID-19 vaccines, you are abandoned by the medical system. The doctors don't want to see you anymore. They don't want to investigate you. They want to have nothing to do with you because they injured you. It's very straightforward. It's the doctors basically committed medical malpractice by recommended the vaccines. They've injured you. Now they don't want to deal with you having that injury. They don't want to treat you. And so the patients are abandoned. And really what the patients are offered at that point, instead of being offered treatment, investigations, and so on, they're offered medically assisted suicide. And this has almost become a meme in Canada that really the healthcare in Canada is have you considered killing yourself? And that's the meme because that is pretty much the only healthcare that a lot of people are offered. We had a young mother in her 30s who was paralyzed by the booster shot, for example. And again, same situation. She's now been offered medically assisted suicide three times, even though she's not interested in medically assisted suicide, but that is where the doctors are pushing her. That's coming from the federal government, but it's also coming from the medical associations and the medical boards. And the medical boards are actually pressuring doctors now in Canada to offer medically assisted suicide to their patients. And if you don't, your license could be in danger if you're not providing that option for your patients. And so, we had a situation recently where the committee that looks at eligibility for medically assisted suicide has proposed expanding access to anyone suffering from a mental illness. And that could be something as simple as depression or anxiety. So imagine you're a person who's sort of overly anxious, or maybe you occasionally get depressed. You will now be offered medically assisted suicide by physicians in Canada. And also, they want to expand it to children. And when it comes to children, they don't want parental involvement or consent. So they want parents out of the picture. And this is very much a communist approach where the children are seen as sort of property of the state. So they want parents out of the picture, and they've come up with this concept of mature minors, where they want a child to be able to make this decision on their own to end their life if they want to. So imagine a depressed teenager, let's say, a teenager who broke up with his girlfriend and is, very distraught over it. And now some sick Canadian doctor is going to come along and say, hey, do you want to commit suicide? I'll help you with that. Recently, we had a situation when a doctor even drove the patient to the place where the medically assisted suicide took place, just to help them, in that. So there's a lot of coercion that's involved as well in this. I think it's a disgusting direction that Canadian healthcare has taken. I do believe Canada is the number one country in the world for organs harvested from individuals who've been through this medically assisted suicide program. And I think it's now serving as a template for other countries that are following in Canada's footsteps, like the UK, for example. And I think that's a very bad, slippery slope to go down on.
Is there a Hippocratic oath that people take when they graduate medical school in Canada?
There is. We take the Hippocratic Oath I believe it's in the second year of our 4-year medical training in medical school. But I think a lot of doctors have basically abandoned the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, especially when it came to the COVID-19 vaccines, where when you looked at the risk and benefit in the vast majority of the cases, at least initially, it seemed the risks outweighed any possible benefits. For example, vaccinating children, vaccinating young people, vaccinating pregnant women. There was no obvious benefit, but there was clearly risks. And so the Hippocratic Oath is includes do no harm, and that's something that's been completely thrown out the window. And we've really had during this pandemic, the entire concept of medical ethics thrown out the window, the concepts of bodily autonomy, informed consent. Informed consent is actually forbidden
Oh,
in Canada. It is doctors are not allowed to provide informed consent to their patients. And the way that has been accomplished was when it came to the vaccines, there was a memo issued to doctors early on saying you're not allowed to tell your patients anything that might cause vaccine hesitancy or that might cause them to maybe reconsider getting a COVID-19 vaccine. Well, right there, they made informed consent illegal. And it was punishable by, you potentially losing your medical license. And so we've just seen just a wholesale destruction of medical ethics across the board, the Hippocratic Oath. And I think this is something that has caused irreparable damage to medicine in general in countries like Canada, United States, Australia, UK. I think we're seeing sort of a slow destruction of medicine as we knew it.
my God, that is astonishing. So, if you can't give informed consent and you don't have to follow the Hippocratic Oath and you're pressured to get people to commit suicide, that sounds like, is this coming from the government or is this coming from somewhere else?
Well, it's a lot of it is coming from the government, and I think it comes from the government and then it sort of filters through the medical bureaucracy. Because ultimately, at least in Canada, the medical bureaucracy is very much subservient to the federal government, not the provincial governments. We're told that it's the provinces that administer healthcare, and that's not true. The provinces give money for the administration of healthcare, but the bureaucracy, the administration of healthcare is loyal to the federal government, which is the Trudeau Liberal government. And so in Canada, Justin Trudeau and his government have been extremely pro-MAID, medical assistance in dying. And I think, they've been really pushing that very, very heavily. We know that the Trudeau government was also very pro-mRNA vaccines. They invested, in fact, in the beginning, the Trudeau government bought, I believe it was at least 8 vaccines for every man, woman, and child in Canada. And this was when the first two doses were rolled out, and this was supposed to be a 2-dose vaccine. And yet he bought 8 vaccines for every man, woman, and child from Pfizer and Moderna and so on. So it was clear that this government had gone all in on this failed technology. The Trudeau government provided funding for the building of mRNA vaccine factories, which is being built now in Quebec. And so a lot of this, I believe a lot of this destruction of the Hippocratic Oath, informed consent, is coming from the federal government. And the courts have also abandoned their ethical standards. And so we see the courts are actually upholding the loss of informed consent, the loss of bodily autonomy, and the loss of the Hippocratic Oath. And of course, the courts are filled with judges who were appointed by the Trudeau government. In fact, if you haven't donated to Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party, you will not be appointed as a judge. Usually it's donors who have a long history of donating to the Liberal Party who are then appointed as judges and then are put to preside over these cases. So all the abuses that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic that were either abuses of citizens or abuses of small businesses were really upheld by the judges who were Liberal judges who were basically donors to the Trudeau government. So I think it is ultimately coming from the government, but the way it's administered is through a corrupt bureaucracy or corrupt judges.
So, what does the media say about ivermectin, cancer, and COVID-19 now? Has it changed since the start of the pandemic?
So, I mean, the media was the propaganda arm of the Trudeau government, at least in Canada. And the media actually receives very extensive funding from the federal government, without which the media would basically go bankrupt. I think they've received, billions of dollars in funding just to stay afloat. And so the media really will push whatever the government approved narrative is for COVID-19. And of course, the government approved narrative was that ivermectin doesn't work in COVID-19, so don't use it. It's a horse dewormer, and that's it. And that you could only use it, to treat parasites, and that's that. And so the media has stuck to that, and really, they haven't done any investigative work looking at the successes that some of us physicians have had with ivermectin in cancer patients. I've had, I've published this on my Substack. I've published it on Twitter, and I was banned from Twitter for a year, just for raising concerns about mRNA vaccines in children. I was banned for over a year and censored when it came to that. But I was allowed back on Twitter by Elon Musk's team. My account was restored. And I've gone on to become the most followed physician in Canada. And I'm right now the most followed oncologist in the world in terms of social media following. And so I've been publishing some successes that I've had in terms of cancer patients with ivermectin. But also, I've published successes with Lyme disease. I've published successes with Parkinson's disease, certain autoimmune conditions, skin conditions, dermatitis. But the media has ignored all of it. This is normally the media should show interest when there is a new development and when patients are having success where conventional medicine has failed them and they try, a repurposed drug, for example, and let's say they have tremendous success. I had a Lyme disease, patient who had suffered with joint problems for decades. He took ivermectin for a few weeks and his joint inflammation and joint problems resolved completely. And no doctor had been able to do that for him for the previous 20 years. And yet I get, when the media does mention me, they smear me, they attack me, they attack me as an anti-vaxxer, even though I've had more vaccines than, probably all the media people combined. And all they do is attack and smear because, if I'm using something that's not in the government approved narrative, then they attack you. So unfortunately, the Canadian media has been absolutely atrocious with anything medical related.
So you're using antiparasitics. Do you think that parasites are in cancer, or do you think there's another mechanism that makes it work? How does it work, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a very interesting theory. So so there is a theory that there is a relationship between parasites and cancer. And although I've not seen that in my career, I can't dismiss it. I can't dismiss the possibility that there may be some kind of a relationship there. Now, the preclinical research that's looked at ivermectin has identified at least a dozen different mechanisms by which ivermectin is affecting cancer cells. And so there's a number of proliferation pathways that ivermectin inhibits in cancer cells. Ivermectin inhibits cancer stem cells, which are cancer cells that are particularly resistant to chemotherapy, for example. It inhibits certain proteins and enzymes that allow cancer cells to disconnect themselves and then travel to distant sites and create metastases. So it actually prevents cancer cells from being able to travel to distant parts and being able to metastasize. So there's inhibition of metastases, there's inhibition of the functioning of the mitochondria, and it actually directly stops cell proliferation during the cell cycle. It actually causes cell cycle arrest when the cancer cell is trying to proliferate and create more cells from itself. So there's been over a dozen mechanisms discovered by preclinical researchers of how ivermectin impacts cancer. And it seems to act in different ways on different cancers, which is very fascinating. And when you look at something like fenbendazole or mebendazole, which is also an antiparasitic, but it acts in different ways, has different mechanisms. I'll give an example. So for example, fenbendazole will block glucose transporters on cancer cells. And we know that cancer cells use sugar as a fuel source. And here you have fenbendazole that's blocking the glucose transporters from being able to take up the sugar. So effectively, it's starving the cancer cell from being able to use sugar. It also increases levels of p53 tumor suppressor protein. And p53 is implicated in about 60 to 70% of all cancers as being damaged, a tumor suppressor protein that's damaged And what that protein does is it actually initiates a programmed cell death of the cancer, apoptosis. And so by restoring P53 levels, the tumor cells then are put into this apoptosis process where it's a programmed cell death of cancer cells. So the fenbendazole stimulates that. So there's numerous mechanisms. They're very interesting. They're fascinating. I think some of those mechanisms may also overlap with how they kill parasites. And so there's overlap in how some of these will kill parasites and cancer cells where they kill them by the same method. But it's fascinating that, there's actually over a dozen mechanisms that each of these antiparasitic drugs has. And when they look at combining it with chemo, you actually get better outcomes when you combine ivermectin with chemo than chemo on its own, because you've got these additional mechanisms by which the ivermectin is attacking the cancer. The chemo is doing its thing, ivermectin is doing its thing, and you end up with more overall cancer cell killing. Patients do better. There's better outcomes. And interestingly, patients also have less side effects.
That's great. A treatment that has fewer side effects and could potentially cure people more effectively than chemotherapy, which is said to damage the body as part of the cure. Is there anything else you recommend in conjunction to these new treatments that could help people with cancer?
Yes, I always advise people to look at bioactive compounds that these are compounds, anti-cancer compounds that are found in nature, in natural products. So for example, curcumin, very powerful anti-cancer compound found in turmeric spice. There are anti-cancer compounds in garlic and ginger, so you can add those into your diet. Soursop is the popular one. It's an exotic tropical fruit that has anti-cancer mechanisms. Apricot seeds, there are some people that know that apricot seeds contain certain compounds like amygdalin that have anti-cancer mechanisms. So I always say, look, 60 to 70% of chemotherapy is derived from plants. It's derived from natural products. I think we have to go back and look towards natural products and see some of the, that a lot of cancer-fighting compounds are there that we can benefit from. Look at the Mediterranean diet. They consume a lot of olive oil, and now they've discovered that olive oil, olive leaves, they have these anti-cancer compounds, for example, oleuropein, that are very powerful against cancer, and you can get it instead of, let's say, consuming the Mediterranean diet. You can get supplements. You can get olive leaf extract supplements, for example, and you can get that into your system. So I'd say, look at bioactive compound, look at medicinal mushrooms like chaga mushroom, like lion's mane, turkey tail mushroom. These are mushrooms that also have anti-cancer properties. So I think it's good to combine those things, get some of those things into your diet, take some of those supplements in combination with repurposed drugs like ivermectin and fenbendazole.
What assistance would researchers like yourself want or need from the public, since official channels don't seem to be able to provide it, to help you progress your research so that it gets legitimized along with the others that given more generous pathways towards legitimacy?
Well, I can tell you, I've received tremendous support from the public through my Substack and through my Substack articles. I have 60,000 subscribers and readers. Some of them are paid. And so that has been an excellent source of support. Substack is a platform for writers. And what I've noticed is that some of us physicians who've been persecuted by the mainstream medical establishment have sort of drifted towards platforms like Substack, where we can write medical articles without being persecuted, without, fear of losing our jobs and so on. And we can actually get support from the public. So I have paid subscribers who are doing it either as a donation to help me continue my research, and of course to access a certain material and certain articles. So you will see Dr. Mercola has one of the most popular Substacks, but other doctors like Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Pierre Corey, myself, we all have Substacks where we are doing our medical writing, but it also gives us the support from the public that we need to pay the bills and sort of stay afloat and be able to continue doing our work. I have started cancer consultations outside the medical system. What I've noticed is that as some people have had success with my approach, my treatments, my protocols, it just spreads by word of mouth. And so I don't actually advertise my cancer consultations because I'm so flooded with requests by word of mouth that it just sort of takes care of itself. And so I think people should look into supporting the healthcare providers. And it doesn't have to be a doctor. It could be a nurse, it could be a physiotherapist, it could be a naturopath, but people should support the health professionals who remained ethical during the pandemic, doctors who kept their Hippocratic oath during the pandemic, and really healthcare providers who were persecuted for doing the right thing. I think people should go to those healthcare providers, should support them, and kind of make sure that they can continue to really practice medicine or whatever form of medicine that they're practicing at this time.
Have you thought about crowdfunding?
I have, but I haven't really seen the need to at this time. As you know, Substack is its own platform, and so it provides you an ability to get funded. And then, of course, as I started my cancer consultations, that has been growing on its own. If I were to, let's say, create a company or maybe expand the cancer treatments to a larger, maybe a facility, that would be something interesting that maybe I could use. I could think about crowdfunding. And I think that's going to happen. We're going to see a parallel healthcare system created. I think it's happening already. As the mainstream healthcare system is crumbling and deteriorating, we will see alternative healthcare system arise in its place.
That's good. Do you think there needs to be more public pressure put on officials, more awareness about these new cancer treatments that don't seem to be on the radar of ordinary people, the majority of people, I mean?
Certainly. I mean, public pressure is always good. Unfortunately, I think we've not seen success with public pressure put on, whether it was with the COVID-19 vaccines and them being rolled out in children. I thought there would be tremendous public resistance against rolling out the COVID vaccines in children because of the dangers to kids, and we really didn't see that. We didn't see the public pushback very hard. We did see the public pushback against the vaccine mandates. Of course, we saw the truckers in Canada put tremendous pressure on the government and actually get them to back off mandates. But for the most part, it doesn't seem to have worked. So I think certainly it would be great for the public to put pressure on the politicians to really allow sort of an expansion and allow the mainstream medical establishment to look at things like ivermectin in use of cancer without being afraid of being, punished or retaliated against. But that would require a complete overhaul of the medical associations, the medical institutions, the medical bodies. I mean, if you can get punished, with a $40,000 fine and is stripped of your medical license just for writing a couple of prescriptions of ivermectin for COVID, which is really nothing in my opinion. I've taken ivermectin for COVID and it was great. I was symptom free within 2 days. How anyone could be punished for that to me is beyond comprehension. But if the government can't fix that, we're long ways away from really introducing, repurposed drugs in the use of cancer. These institutions would have to be completely overhauled. And I have not seen, other than Donald Trump and RFK Jr. talking about basically dismantling some of these corrupt medical institutions, I've certainly not seen anything like that being talked about in Canada.
That is very unfortunate to hear. Thank you very much for being on the Kiwi Rocket. I wish you luck with your cancer research, your treating of patients, and I really do look forward to the day when people like you get rewarded for what you've done properly and have more widespread recognition. I'm hoping the evil will fall. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Hey guys, William Makis here. For consultations or information regarding my revised protocol, please email williammakis4205@gmail.com.